3 days before my wedding, my fiancé's parents drove 90 minutes from the coast to my apartment to hand me a prenup, and his mother smiled the whole time she did it. Not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. The smile you give a kid who's about to lose a game she doesn't even know she's playing. She set the folder on my kitchen counter and slid it toward me with 2 fingers, like she didn't want to touch the laminate any longer than she had to. What she didn't know, what neither of them had bothered to find out in the 4 years their son had been with me, was that I'd been quietly sitting on $8.5 million, a grandmother's worth of patience, and the home number of an estate attorney in Boston who had spent 40 years taking apart people exactly like them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because the smile is only the ending of a long story and you should understand how I got there. I met the man I was going to marry at a fundraiser almost didn't go to. I run a small architecture firm, the kind that restores old buildings instead of tearing them down, churches and mill houses and the occasional crumbling library that some town can't afford to lose. It's not glamorous work. I spent a lot of time in basements with a flashlight, arguing with contractors about load-bearing walls. He was there as a legal aid attorney, the unpaid kind, representing tenants who were about to get evicted from a building I'd been hired to assess. We ended up on the same side of an argument with the developer, and 3 hours later we were the last 2 people in the room, and that was that. He was kind in a way that I didn't trust at first, because I'd dated enough men to know that kind usually meant weak. He wasn't weak. He was just raised by people who taught him that money was a kind of weather, something that happened to you, that you adjusted around, that you didn't talk about because talking about it was vulgar. His family had old Boston money, real estate mostly. His father had built a name developing waterfront properties up and down the South Shore, and the family's crown jewel was a place called Seabright Landing, a sprawling luxury senior living and condominium development that his father talked about the way other men talk about their children. I didn't care about any of that. I want to be honest with you, because this story doesn't work if you think I was after their money. I had my own. I just hadn't told anyone. My grandmother raised me in a duplex in Quincy with a leaky storm door in a vegetable garden that took up most of the backyard. She'd been a seamstress and then a high school homey teacher, and she clipped coupons until the day she died and reused tinfoil and darned socks that should have been thrown out. When I was a girl, I thought we were poor. I thought everybody who wasn't poor lived like the families on television. What I didn't understand, what nobody understood, was that she'd started buying stock in 1971 with the money she made taking in alterations. And she never stopped, and she never sold, and she never told a soul. When she passed, her attorney called me into his office and slid a folder across the desk. I'd come expecting maybe to split a savings account with my sister. Instead, I found out my grandmother had died with a portfolio worth more than $7 million, plus 2 paid-off rental triple-deckers in Dorchester she'd been quietly collecting rent on for 30 years. I sat in that office and I cried, and not because of the money. I cried because I understood, finally, what she'd been doing. She lived small, so I'd have the option to live large. She told me once, near the end, when I thought she was just rambling, the loudest people in the room are usually the ones with the least. Real money keeps its mouth shut. I didn't get it then. I got it in that office. She left a bulk to me. I was the one who'd lived with her, who'd driven her to chemo, who'd held her hand. But she didn't forget my sister. She'd set up a separate account for her years before, smaller but generous, plus one of the triple-deckers outright. People always ask me about that, like there's some buried resentment there. There isn't. My sister knows exactly what she got and exactly why, and she's the one who told me, the night before everything blew up, to stop hiding and start using the woman our grandmother had made me into. So that's the secret I was carrying when his mother slid that folder across my counter. Here's the thing I need you to understand about the 4 years before that night. It wasn't one big insult. It was 1,000 small ones, the kind that are so small that if you complain about any single one, you sound crazy. It started the week we got engaged. His mother called me at 7 in the morning. She was always calling at 7. Like the early hour proved how seriously she took things. To tell me she'd already booked appointments at 2 venues she liked. I'd mentioned wanting to get married at the botanical garden where he'd first told me he loved me, out under the old copper beech. She laughed at that. A short, dry little laugh. That's sweet, dear, but outdoors? In New England? What happens when it rains in front of 300 people? There would not, of course, be 300 people. That was just the number she'd already decided on. Then came dinner at the club. His father's club, the kind where you don't apply, you inherit. Somewhere between the oysters and the entree, his father started asking me about my firm. Casual, easy, like he was just curious. What are your margins, roughly? When I gave him a careful answer, he tilted his head. Roughly isn't a number, dear. In business, we deal in actuals. I told him we were profitable, which we were, very. He smiled like I'd said something cute. Then he moved on to my grandmother. He'd heard she raised me modestly and asked, in the gentlest voice you've ever heard, whether I'd had a lot of student debt, whether that had been a strain. He was building a file on me. I could feel it. He'd already decided who I was, a striver, a girl from Quincy who'd clawed her way into a profession and was now trying to marry up. And every question was just confirmation. My fiancé, to his credit, put his hand on my knee under the table and said, "Dad, she's not on the witness stand." His father waved it off. But I noticed he said it. I want you to remember that he said it, because it matters later. The guest list was its own war. We'd made ours together. About 70 people who actually meant something to us. His mother took one look and produced 3 typed pages of her own. 90 additional names, not one of whom I recognized. Business contacts. Club people. A state senator. These are people who expect to be invited to a Seabright wedding, she told me, and I realized that to her I wasn't marrying her son. I was marrying a brand, and the brand had obligations. The lowest point, before the night itself, was the dress fitting. I'd chosen something simple, a clean emerald green silk. I'd never been a white dress person, and green was my grandmother's favorite color, the color of her garden in July. His mother had invited herself along. She walked a slow circle around me on that little platform and pronounced to the seamstress, not to me, "It's very plain. Doesn't a Seabright bride want to make more of an impression?" Then she suggested a designer she knew who could do something with more presence. I went home and sat on my bathroom floor and called my sister, and my sister said the thing I'd been refusing to think. She's not criticizing your taste, she's training you. Every time she overrides you and you let her, she learns she can. By the time you've got kids, she'll be picking their schools. I wanted to argue. I couldn't, because I knew she was right, and worse, I knew the only test that mattered was whether the man I loved would stand between me and his mother when it counted, and I didn't know the answer. I got my answer sooner than I expected, and it surprised me. About a month before the wedding, at a Sunday dinner at his parents' house in Marblehead, his mother said something, I don't even remember the exact words, something about how it was generous of the family to be absorbing me, how I'd find the adjustment to their world easier than I feared, and my fiancé set down his fork. He didn't raise his voice. He just said very quietly, "Mom, she has her own world. A good one. We're not absorbing anyone. If you can't be warm to the woman I'm marrying, then we'll be seeing a lot less of each other. And that's a choice you're making, not me." The table went silent. His father stared. His mother's face did something complicated. "And here's what I need you to know," he said all of that before he had any idea about the money. He didn't know about my grandmother's portfolio or the triple-deckers. He thought he was defending a restoration architect with a paid-off student loan and a used Subaru. He stood up for me when he thought I had nothing, and that's the only reason this is a love story and not just a revenge story. His parents, though, didn't take the hint. They took it as a declaration of war. Which brings me back to the folder on my counter. 3 days before the wedding, at almost 8 o'clock on a Wednesday night. They came without calling. My fiancé was conveniently, suspiciously unreachable. Tied up with a closing, his mother said, which I would later learn was a lie they'd engineered, a dinner they'd invented to get him out of the way. It was just the two of them in my little kitchen, and his mother set down the folder, and his father stood by the door with his arms crossed, like a man who'd come to repossess a car. "We thought it was best to handle this directly," his mother said, "before the wedding. So there are no surprises." I opened the folder. It was a prenuptial agreement, but calling it that is generous. It was 31 pages of one-directional cruelty. It didn't protect his assets from mine. That would have been reasonable, and I'd have signed something reasonable in a heartbeat. It claimed mine. There was a clause stating that any intellectual property or business value I created or enhanced during the marriage would be subject to a family interest. My firm. The thing I'd built with my own hands. There was language designed to wall off every dollar of theirs and reach across the table for every dollar of mine, present and future. It assumed I had little and would never have much, and it was structured to make sure of it. I read it slowly. I made myself read every page while his mother drummed her nails on her handbag, and his father stared a hole in the back of my head. "We'll need it signed before the rehearsal," his mother said. "Notarized. There's a notary at the bank on Hancock Street who opens at 9. If you sign in the morning, this is all forgotten and we have a lovely weekend." "And if I don't?" I asked. She'd been waiting for that. "Then there's no wedding. And by tomorrow afternoon, every guest on that list, our list, 300 people, will understand exactly why. A young woman who won't sign a simple prenup. I'll let them draw their own conclusions about what that says." It was, I'll admit, beautifully designed. Sign and surrender or refuse and be branded a gold digger in front of 300 people who already half believed it. They'd built a trap with no good exit, and they were so sure of themselves that his mother had already started gathering her coat. I want to tell you I had some witty comeback. I didn't. My heart was going like a hammer. I just walked to my door, opened it, and said, "You can leave now." His mother turned at the threshold. 9 a.m., she said. "If we don't have your signature by then, I make the calls. Remember that you forced this." And she smiled at me again. That same smile. And then they were gone, and I stood in my kitchen with 31 pages of contempt on my counter, and my whole life feeling like it had a crack running through it. And then I did what my grandmother raised me to do. I kept my mouth shut, and I went to the phone, and I called the one person who'd been waiting 4 years for these people to make exactly this mistake. She picked up on the second ring even though it was nearly 9 at night. I'd inherited my grandmother's attorney along with the portfolio, a woman named Margot Devine who'd handled my grandmother's estate and who, at 71, had no more patience for bullies than she'd had at 30. She'd been managing my affairs quietly for 6 years. She knew exactly how much I was worth, down to the dollar, and she knew that nobody in my fiancé's family had any idea. "Tell me everything," she said, "and don't leave anything out, and write down every word those people said while it's fresh, because we are going to need it." I told her, the folder, the ambush, the ultimatum, the fact that they'd lured their own son out of the house to do it. There was a pause on the line, and then her voice changed. It got cold and precise, like a scalpel coming out of its tray. "Read me the worst clause," she said. I read it. I heard her exhale. 40 years, she said, and that's one of the ugliest things I've seen drafted by a real firm. Here's the first thing you need to understand. A prenup handed to you under duress with no independent counsel, 3 days before the wedding, with a threat attached. No competent judge in this state enforces that. It's voidable on its face. Coercion. They've handed you a weapon and called it a contract. Don't sign it. Don't sign anything. I'm getting in the car. She lived in Boston. She was at my door in under an hour, in a charcoal coat with a leather bag that had probably outlived 2 of my relationships. Her silver hair pinned up like she was going to court instead of to a 1-bedroom in Quincy at 10 at night. She read the document at my kitchen table with her reading glasses down on her nose, and every few pages she made a small sound, like a doctor finding something on an X-ray she doesn't like. When she finished, she took the glasses off and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "This isn't a prenup," she said. "It's a leash. They're not protecting their money. They're trying to own you, and they've been so arrogant about it that they've left their throat completely exposed. Now, pour me a coffee and tell me what you want, because you have options most people in your chair would kill for. And that's when I made the decision that changed everything. I could have just refused and let the wedding fall apart and walked away clean. But I didn't want clean. I wanted these people to understand, all the way down, exactly who they'd spent 4 years condescending to. I don't want to walk away, I told her. I want them to sign their own surrender, and I want to do it without ever raising my voice. She smiled for the first time that night. "Good girl," she said. "Your grandmother would be insufferable right now. Let's get to work." We worked until 2 in the morning. We drafted a new prenuptial agreement, a real one, the kind I'd have happily signed any day. It was balanced. It protected both of us equally. It walled off my premarital assets as separate property, which is just standard and fair, and it did the same for his. It protected my firm and my intellectual property completely. And then Margot added a clause of her own, with a kind of grim joy I'll never forget. A non-interference clause, language that barred either spouse's family from exerting financial pressure or control over the marriage with teeth attached. "If they want to play this game," she said, "we'll make sure it cuts in exactly one direction, theirs." But the document wasn't the real weapon. The real weapon was a folder of my own, and what was inside it, I didn't fully understand until Margot laid it out on the table around midnight. "You know your portfolio's holdings?" she asked me. "Some of them. I never looked that closely. You manage it." She pulled out a printout and slid it across the table and pointed at a line and asked me if I knew what it was. I didn't, so she explained. A few years back, when Seabright Landing was being built, his father had deeded financing for a phase of the project, the marina and the high-end condo wing, the part he was proudest of. He'd gone to a private real estate fund for a mezzanine loan, the kind of financing that sits behind the bank and carries real leverage if the project ever stumbles. And that fund, Margot told me, had been one of my grandmother's long-time holdings, the kind of quiet, boring, patient investment she'd been making her whole life. Over the years, through my account, I'd become one of the fund's larger limited partners. Not the manager, but a significant stake. Which meant, and Margot said this slowly so I'd understand, that I was, indirectly but very really, one of the people his father owed money to on the project he loved most in the world. The crown jewel he bragged about at every dinner. The thing with my fiancé's family name on the sign. I sat there for a long minute. I thought about his mother's smile. I thought about, doesn't a Seabright bride want to make more of an impression? I thought about my grandmother darning socks in a duplex in Quincy. "They have no idea," I said. "None," Margot said. "You've been very quiet, just like she taught you. I want to tell you about my fiancé, because the next part is his." He said it like he was asking me to me, or I'm calling off the engagement. Sign the house over calling off the engagement. He looked like he was asked the slept in a year. He said it was wrinkled and his eyes were red, and he came in without a word and stood there. Before I could say anything, he started talking, fast. They lied to me. There was no closing. I got home and the housekeeper let it slip that they'd driven out here, and I just knew, and I confronted them and we had the worst fight of my life. I told them if the price of their approval was ambushing the woman I'm about to marry, they could keep their approval and their money and all of it. I told them I'd walk away from the firm, the trust, everything. He stopped. His voice cracked. "And I came straight here. I don't care what they threatened. I'm marrying you. If we have to do it at City Hall with 2 strangers as witnesses, I'm marrying you." And here's the thing. He said all of that, every word, before I told him about the money. He didn't know about the $8.5 million. He didn't know about the fund or the leverage or any of it. He thought he was choosing a restoration architect with a used Subaru over his entire inheritance, and he chose her anyway. sitting in her kitchen at midnight with nothing to gain and everything to lose. So I told him. I slid my phone across the table the way his mother had slid the folder across the counter, except mine had a brokerage statement on the screen. I watched him read it. I watched the number go in and not register, and then register. He looked up at me, and then back down, and then up again. He couldn't finish. 8.5 million, I said, plus the firm, plus property in Dorchester, my grandmother. She lived in a duplex and clipped coupons, and she left it all to me, and I've never told anyone, because I wanted to be loved for who I am, and I needed to know that you loved me when you thought I had nothing. I paused, and tonight, an hour ago, you proved it. So now I can tell you. He put his face in his hands. When he looked up, he was almost laughing, a stunned, broken kind of laugh. My mother, he said. My mother spent 4 years making little comments about your Subaru. My father interrogated you about your margins. And the whole time, he shook his head. You could have bought their club. You could have bought 10 of their clubs. There's more, I said, and I told him about the fund and Seabright Landing and the loan. And the laughter stopped because he understood the real estate world better than I did, and he understood instantly what it meant. You're behind the marina financing, he said slowly, on Seabright. The project he couldn't even finish. Do you understand what you're holding? Margot's been explaining it to me all night, I said. I'm not going to wreck anything. I'm not that person. I just want to be in the room when they find out who they spent 4 years looking down on. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took my hand, and he said, Then I want to be in the room too, on your side of the table. The meeting was the next afternoon, the day before the wedding, in a conference room at Margot's office in the financial district, with a view of the harbour I'd helped restore a piece of years before. Though they didn't know that either. His parents came expecting a signed copy of their prenup and the chastened girl from Quincy. They walked into a different movie than the one they'd bought a ticket for. I wore the emerald green dress, the one his mother had called plain. I wore it on purpose. Margot sat at the head of the table looking like the last 40 years of legal practice had been training for this exact hour. His father started talking before he'd even sat down, all bluster, demanding to know what this was about, why his son was sitting on my side of the table where the signed agreement was. I let Margot handle the law. She slid their 31-page document back across the table, face down, and explained in the flat, patient voice of someone explaining gravity to a child that the agreement they drafted was voidable on its face, executed under duress, 3 days before a wedding, with no independent counsel and an explicit threat attached, that no judge in the Commonwealth would enforce it, that if they ever tried, the documentation we'd assembled the night of the ambush would bury them. His father's face went a shade I'd never seen on a living person. Then she slid our document across. Fair, balanced, protective of both of us, with the family non-interference clause sitting in it like a landmine. This, she said, is what your son and his fiancé are prepared to sign. Both of them. The 2 people actually getting married. Your signatures appear nowhere on it because you are not parties to this marriage, and you never should have been parties to that. She taps their face-down folder. But you'll want to read it, particularly the non-interference clause, because going forward, any attempt to use money to pressure this household will be a breach with consequences. His mother found her voice. And why? She said, with the last scrap of her old confidence. Would we agree to any of that? And that was my part. I'd waited 4 years and I wasn't going to rush it. I opened my own folder and I laid out the statements, one at a time, like cards. My grandmother's portfolio, the firm's valuation, the Dorchester properties. The total, written out, 8.5 million and climbing. And I watched his mother's smile finally die. You spent 4 years, I said very quietly, deciding what I was, a striver, a girl who needed your son and your name and your world. You never once asked me a real question. If you had, you might have found out that I've had more in liquid assets than your son this whole time. That I've sat at your table at the club knowing I could have bought the membership for everyone in the room. I let that land. Then I slid the last page across, the one about the fund, the one Margot had prepared. And you might have found out who's been quietly holding a piece of the financing on Seabright Landing, the marina, the condo wing, the part you talk about at every dinner. His father picked up the page. His hands weren't steady. He read it twice. He's a developer. He didn't need it explained. He understood all the way down that the woman his wife had been condescending to for 4 years was sitting on leverage over his proudest achievement, and that she'd been doing it with the patience of someone who was never, ever going to mention it, unless they made her. I'm not going to do anything with it, I said. I'm not you. I don't use money as a leash. I'm telling you so that you understand for the rest of your lives exactly who you tried to bully in my kitchen the night before last. That's all. That's the whole revenge. I want you to see me clearly because you never have. His mother sat down. I don't think she meant to. I think her legs just stopped holding her. We got married the next day, outdoors, under a copper beech, and it didn't rain. About 70 people came, our 70. The ones who mattered. My sister stood up as my maid of honor in a dress the color of my grandmother's roses, and at the reception she leaned over and whispered, "She'd have loved every second of this." The quiet part especially. My fiancé's parents came. They were subdued in a way I'd never seen. Polite in a way that, for the first time, looked a little like respect because it was finally built on the truth. His father pulled me aside near the end of the night. He's not a man who apologizes easily. I don't think he managed the actual word. But he said, I misjudged you. Badly. And then, because he couldn't help himself, your grandmother, the investing, that's a remarkable thing. Coming from him, that was practically falling to his knees. It's been a little over a year now. I never did anything with the leverage. I didn't have to. It just sits there, quiet, the way my grandmother taught me, and everyone in that family knows it's there, and that knowledge alone rearranged how they treat me more thoroughly than any threat could have. His mother calls before she visits now, and asks, and accepts it when the answer is no. His father forwards me real estate deals, and actually wants my opinion. We see them about once a month, which is exactly the right amount. My sister and I split a beach week every summer now, paid for out of the accounts our grandmother built for both of us, and we toast her every single time with whatever cheap wine she'd have approved of. Sometimes I think about that smile his mother gave me across the counter, the one that was so sure it had already won. I think she believed money was a thing you waved in someone's face. My grandmother knew it was the opposite. Real money keeps its mouth shut and waits, she used to say, and the only time you ever show your hand is when someone makes you, and then you only show enough. They thought they were ambushing a girl with nothing. They never once considered that the quietest person at the table might be the one holding everything. That's the mistake the loud ones always make. They mistake silence for weakness, and by the time they learn the difference, the cards are already on the table, and it's far too late to take the smile back. That smile across my kitchen counter still visits me sometimes, late at night when the house is quiet. My mother-in-law was so certain she'd already won that she'd brought her coat to the table before I'd even finished reading, and I understand now that her certainty was never about me. It was about what she'd decided I was. She built a whole story out of my used Subaru and my cringy childhood, and she was so comfortable inside that story that she never once thought to check whether it was true. Here's what I've come to believe, after all of it. Nothing in that room happened by accident. The reason I had a choice that night, the reason I had a lawyer to call and a folder to slide across the table, is that a woman in a duplex spent 50 years saying no to the new coat and yes to one more share of stock. My grandmother's patience became my options. Cause and effect stretched across a lifetime. The seeds she planted in 1971 are the only reason I had anything to harvest in that conference room. But the money was never the real thing she gave me. And I want to be careful saying this because it would be easy to hear this story and think the lesson is have $8 million. It isn't. When his parents ambushed me, I had 3 real choices, and only one of them came from money. I could have signed and surrendered. I could have screamed and burned it all down. Instead, I kept my mouth shut and made a phone call, and that restraint didn't come from my bank account. It came from being raised right. From a grandmother who taught me that you don't repay cruelty with cruelty, that you don't use what you have as a leash even when you could, that the goal is to be seen clearly, not to destroy. That's the part I'm proudest of. I held real leverage over the thing my father-in-law loved most, and I chose to do nothing with it but let him know it was there. The clear thinking, knowing to call Margot before I said a word, documenting everything while it was fresh, understanding that their own arrogance was the weapon. That's something you build, not something you inherit. And the nerve to open my own front door and tell 2 powerful people to leave, the night before my whole future hung in the balance, that was the hardest part, and the most important. Money can buy a lawyer. It can't buy the steadiness to stay calm while your heart is breaking. So if you take anything from what happened to me, let it be this. Build the quiet strength to do right when doing wrong would feel so much better. Sharpen your judgment in the calm years so it's there for you in the loud ones. And practice the kind of courage that doesn't shout. The loud people will always mistake your silence for weakness. Let them. By the time they understand the difference, you'll already be holding everything that matters, and you won't have had to raise your voice even once.